The stale, metallic tang of fear was a familiar taste in Rachel Moore's mouth, more constant than food these past few chaotic, soul-siphoning weeks. Tonight, it wasn't just clinging to her throat. It felt like a caustic coating on every breath she drew. She pressed herself deeper into the fetid shadows of a boarded-up storefront, the broken neon sign of a defunct diner. Rosie's place, buzzing erratically overhead, a trapped, dying insect sighing its last. Rain-cold and unforgiving plastered strands of her dark hair to her forehead, trickling down her neck like icy fingers. Her worn coat a cast-off from a shelter donation bin, and a size too big even with the pronounced swell of her belly, offered pathetically little protection against the biting November wind. She wasn't just homeless. She was hunted. A man named Sal Marchetti, a low-level loan shark whose predatory loan to her desperate, now-vanished ex-boyfriend Mark had inexplicably become her inescapable burden, had an uncanny, terrifying way of finding people. The thought of him, his perpetually greasy smile revealing teeth too large for his mouth, and his dead reptilian eyes sent a fresh wave of nausea, hot and acrid, surging through her. Her hand, chapped and trembling, found the protective curve of her unborn child. This was no life, she thought, a silent scream echoing in her mind, no beginning to offer someone innocent. Just as despair, a suffocating blanket, threatened to engulf her, a sleek, black SUV, its windows darkly tinted, pulled silently to the curb, its engine a mere whisper against the cacophony of the storm. A man emerged, his silhouette sharp and imposing against the hazy, diffuse glow of the distant streetlights. James Whitmore, the name a flicker of hope from a discreet, almost clinical ad she'd answered at the battered women's shelter. A desperate long shot, a whispered prayer sent into the void. He was quite possibly her only conceivable way out of this derelict alley, out of this city that had become a concrete cage, away from the ever-present chilling threat of Sal. The morning fog, thick as cream, hung low over the empty Virginia road, softening the stark outlines of ancient pine trees that flanked its edges like silent, melancholic sentinels. Early spring painted the rolling countryside in muted grays and browns, the earth still damp and smelling of incipient life. James Whitmore, once a celebrated titan of tech investment, his name a recurring staple in the glossy pages of Forbes and Fortune, was now a man more profoundly defined by an abyss of loss than by any lingering remnants of innovation. 3 years ago, a horrific car accident on a similarly rain-slicked highway, a cruel irony that never ceased to mock him, had claimed his beloved wife Lydia and left his only son Marcus paralyzed from the waist down. The air inside James's opulent SUV was a stark temperature-controlled contrast to the raw cold outside, yet the tension within, an unspoken, palpable thing, was even colder, heavier. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded with a strange, fierce protectiveness over her swollen belly. Her polite, almost inaudible "thank you" after he'd stowed her meager bag, and her quiet nod before buckling her seatbelt, were her only spoken words since entering the vehicle. Her coat threadbare at the elbows, her boots scuffed and water-stained, spoke volumes of her recent life. But she sat remarkably upright, chin lifted a study, and braced fragile dignity. She felt the plush leather of the seat beneath her, a luxury so foreign it was almost uncomfortable. James Whitmore tapped a restless rhythm on the expensive wood-grain steering wheel, his tailored navy coat a silent testament to enduring wealth. The deep, etched lines around his mouth, however, bespoke countless sleepless nights and a grief that had become a permanent resident in his soul. "You don't have to be afraid, Miss Moore," he said finally, his voice carefully modulated, eyes steadfastly on the road, as if eye contact might betray something he wasn't ready to share. "I'm not," Rachel answered, her voice low, but surprisingly steady. She was thinking of Sal, of the look in his eyes, when he'd last cornered her, and wondered if fear was a luxury she could no longer afford to indulge. This thought brought a new chill sharper than the rain. James risked a quick sideways glance. Her profile was etched against the gray light, showing a resilience he hadn't anticipated. "Good," he said. "Because fear has a nasty habit of drowning people, especially when they're already treading water in the deep end." She didn't reply, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the curve of her belly. He has no idea what deep end means, she thought, a flash of bitter resentment quickly suppressed. James cleared his throat, a dry rustling sound. "I'm going to be completely honest with you, Miss Moore. Your situation, while compelling to Mrs. Kent, isn't why I selected you from the other applicants. It wasn't your resume." "I don't have one," she said flatly, the words unadorned by apology or explanation. A history of part-time music tutoring and gigging in smoky bars didn't exactly scream caregiver. "I know." The silence that followed was thick with unasked questions, with stories untold and pain unvoiced. Rachel turned her gaze to the blurring landscape outside the trees, like a procession of grieving figures. "Then why am I here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, unable to keep the note of bewildered skepticism entirely out of it. James chewed on the truth, literally biting the inside of his lip. "A woman I trust, implicitly Mrs. Kent from the shelter, recommended you. She has a certain insight into people. She told me you were smart, remarkably capable, and that you used to teach music, that you had a sensitivity before I became a charity case dependent on the kindness of strangers, with too much money and apparently too much guilt." Rachel interjected a bitter, acidic edge to her voice that surprised even herself. "Before things got complicated," he corrected gently, his tone unruffled, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Before life dealt you a particularly cruel hand." Rachel looked at him then properly for the first time. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a depth of sorrow she recognized a kindred shadow. "You don't know me, Mr. Whitmore, You don't know the first thing about who I am, what I've done, or what I might be capable of. Why would you even consider bringing a complete unknown someone from my circumstances into your home near your child?" James exhaled slowly, the mist of his breath fogging a patch of the windshield. "Because, Miss Moore, I've employed a dozen caregivers over the past 3 years. All of them came with impeccable degrees, spotless records, and glowing references. None of them made it past the second week. My son, Marcus, needs something or someone truly different. Someone who understands that life isn't always fair, that sometimes you have to play the hand you're dealt no matter how bad it is." "And you think that's me?" she asked, incredulity lacing her tone. "A broken-down musician, running from God knows what?" He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "I don't need someone perfect, Miss Moore. Perfection is an illusion, often a brittle one. I need someone who hasn't given up yet. Someone who knows what it's like to fight." Rachel blinked, pressing her lips together, a small, unconscious gesture of sealing away a fresh surge of emotion. The baby chose that moment to kick a tiny, insistent reminder of her most compelling reason not to give up. "My son doesn't talk much." James added, his voice softening slightly, a hint of raw pain seeping through. "Not since the accident. He's 16, brilliant, and consumed by an anger so profound it's eating him alive. If you're expecting gratitude—" "I'm not," she cut in, her voice firm. Gratitude was for people who had the luxury of choice, not for those clutching at straws. He looked at her again, a longer, more appraising gaze. Hollow cheeks, yes, but a fire still burned in her tired but remarkably alert eyes. There was no pleading desperation there. Just a core of steel, a stark resolve. He recognized it because he saw a fainter, more battered version of it in his own reflection each morning. His secure phone, a separate device from his personal one, buzzed on the console. He picked it up, Yes, Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove's voice, crisp and efficient, even through the slightly crackling connection, came through. The room is prepared as instructed, Mr. Whitmore. The west wing, as we discussed. Clean linens, fresh flowers. The art room, however, remains locked as per your explicit instructions, sir. I've double-checked it. Yes, thank you, Eleanor. A pregnant pause. You've never put anyone in the west wing before, sir. Mrs. Hargrove observed a subtle note of inquiry, perhaps even disapproval, in her tone. It had been Lydia's favorite part of the house, a sanctuary filled with light and her things. James paused, his gaze distant. I know. He ended the call without further explanation. Rachel watched him, intrigued by the undercurrents. She's your housekeeper. She's family, James said quickly, a touch defensively. Eleanor Hargrove has been with us longer than I've owned this house. She practically raised Lydia. She'll be a crucial part of this arrangement, if you decide to stay. If? Rachel echoed, a brow arching. I thought this was a done deal. He pulled the car onto a sweeping gravel driveway that crunched satisfyingly under the tires. The mansion loomed before them, gray stone, weathered, but undeniably elegant, with ivy clinging to its walls like ancient secrets. It was a place where sound seemed to be swallowed whole, absorbed by the sheer weight of its history. If you still want the job after meeting Marcus, James said quietly, his voice tinged with a weary resignation. He has a way of testing people. Rachel finished for him, tilting her head, like his father. Is this another test, Mr. Whitmore? Everything in life is a test, Miss Moore. He murmured, his gaze fixed on the imposing front door. She nodded slowly. One question, though, before we go in. You said you need someone who hasn't given up. What makes you so sure I haven't? James turned off the ignition, the sudden silence amplifying the rain's drumming on the roof. He turned to face her fully. Because you're 7, maybe 8 months pregnant, visibly running from something or someone you won't name. You're dressed in clothes that have seen better days, and yet you sat there with a quiet dignity and still didn't flinch when I told you my son is, to put it mildly, a handful. Most people would have made an excuse by now. You didn't. That's not definitive proof of anything to an objective observer, perhaps. But it is to you, she stated, not asked. It is to me. He paused, unbuckling his seatbelt. Look, Miss Moore, my methods are unconventional. I'm past the point of apologizing for them. They're born of desperation as much as insight. Rachel turned her gaze to the grand, imposing house. Last night I slept in a doorway, Mr. Whitmore, listening for footsteps that weren't the wind, a piece of broken glass clutched in my hand. I told myself if someone offered me anything at all that wasn't Sal, I'd say yes. I'd fight for it. Desperate people often get things done. James said, a ghost of a cynical smile touching his lips as he opened her door. They have the most to lose if they don't. Rachel took his offered hand, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of his watch. It felt surprisingly steady. It's a big place, she murmured, her eyes scanning the facade, the rows of dark windows like unseeing eyes. Too big, he admitted, his voice hollow, filled with too many ghosts. As they walked towards the massive oak front door, Rachel, emboldened by his earlier candor, asked again, Why me, Mr. Whitmore, really? There must have been others just as desperate. James gave a bare, almost imperceptible shrug. My wife, Lydia. She was a fierce believer in second chances. She thought everyone deserved one, sometimes more. And frankly, he added, his voice dropping, I need someone who knows what it's like to fight for something that doesn't always love you back. Something that actively resists you. He was talking about Marcus, but Rachel felt the words resonate on a deeper, more personal level with her own unborn child. A child conceived in a relationship that had curdled into fear and betrayal. Rachel stopped dead on the top step, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "Don't make me a metaphor, Mr. Whitmore. Please. I'm tired, not inspiring. I'm a mess, not a lesson. And right now, I'm just profoundly relieved to be out of the rain and hopefully far away from certain elements." Sal's face flashed in her mind again. He actually chuckled, then a dry rustling sound, but genuine. "Fair enough, Miss Moore. No metaphors, just a job offer." He looked at the imposing mansion, then back at her. "All right, let's go see if your prospective employer hates you on sight." They stepped inside. The cavernous hallway smelled of aged lemon polish, old dust, something indefinably floral. Lavender, perhaps, and faint, almost spectral traces of music. Morning light filtered through a magnificent stained glass window depicting a pastoral scene did little to warm the polished marble floor or the dark, wood-paneled walls. Mrs. Hargrove, her posture as rigid as a queen, her silver bun coiled tightly at the nape of her neck, greeted them with a curt nod. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over Rachel a swift, comprehensive inventory that missed nothing from the scuffed boots to the haunted look in her eyes, lingering for a moment on her swollen belly. She led Rachel towards the west wing with an air of solemn duty. "He's awake." The older woman said, her voice low and resonant, stopping at a thick, imposing white door. "Always is. Pain, you see, is a very effective alarm clock." Rachel nodded, feeling a pang of anticipatory empathy. Mrs. Hargrove's gaze was still weighing, measuring. "A piece of unsolicited advice, Miss Moore. Don't try to impress him. He doesn't care for performative sympathy. But he'll see right through you if you try too hard to be something you're not. He has an almost preternatural knack for sensing dishonesty." Her eyes flicked meaningfully to Rachel's worn single bag resting by the doorway. Rachel managed a wry, tired smile. "Trying too hard isn't really in my current repertoire, Mrs. Hargrove. I'm running on empty." A soft, almost imperceptible snort, which might have been amusement or agreement, escaped Mrs. Hargrove. She stepped aside, gesturing towards the door. "He'll have heard our approach. His hearing is exceptionally acute." As if on cue, a voice from inside, flat, young, and utterly devoid of inflection, called out, "Are you planning to stand out there whispering all day, or are you another well-meaning ghost come to haunt the mausoleum?" Rachel took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and pushed the door open. The room was large, almost cavernous, and surprisingly cold, like a rarely visited museum exhibit. It was filled with expensive, state-of-the-art adaptive technology, a motorized bed, and a complex array of monitors, yet a thin film of dust lay over many surfaces, a testament to disuse or disinterest. A half-finished, intricate model of a vintage race car lay abandoned on a side table alongside a forgotten, slightly deflated basketball. Marcus Whitmore sat in a custom high-tech wheelchair, expensive headphones draped around his neck like a discarded garland. He didn't turn his gaze fixed on the rain-lashed window. "You're early," he said, his voice still monotone. "My father usually allows his new recruits a cup of coffee before throwing them to the wolf." "Didn't get the memo on arriving fashionably late." Rachel replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She let her gaze drift around the room, noting the books piled high, but seemingly unread, the art supplies untouched. "You can drop the pretense of cheerfulness. They all start out chipper. It rarely lasts." Rachel brushed her fingers across a dusty bookshelf, picked up the basketball. "Spalding, worn grip. Looks like it's seen some action." "It's none of your business," he snapped, though his head remained averted. She put it down gently, precisely where it had been. You're right. It isn't. Finally, Marcus turned his wheelchair with a soft whir. His face was sharper, younger than his voice suggested, but etched with a weariness that belied his 16 years. His eyes, the same startling blue as his father's, were shadowed and held a defensive glint. I give you 3 days. Tops. Or maybe you'll break Mrs. Henderson's record and last a whole week before you realize I'm a lost cause. And my father's charity is just another gilded cage. You're probably right about the lost cause part, Rachel said, surprising him. But I'm not here for 3 days or even a week. My immediate contract, as I understand it, is for at least the next hour. His brow ticked up a flicker of surprise in his guarded eyes. Clever. Deflection with a veneer of honesty. No, she said, easing herself carefully into a worn armchair near the bookcase, a good 10 feet from him. Just honest. My cleverness quota for the month is pretty much depleted. Marcus eyed her protruding belly with open disdain. They really sent a pregnant woman. That's a new low even for my father's endless parade of pity hires. Is this some sort of twisted experiment, trying to guilt me into submission with impending motherhood? Congratulations. Rachel countered, her tone dry. You're my first billionaire's son. We all have our crosses to bear, I suppose. A breath, not quite a laugh, but close. She reached tentatively for the model car. This is incredible. Do you mind if I... Don't touch that. His voice was suddenly sharp, venomous. Noted. She withdrew her hand immediately. Her gaze flicked to a dust-covered, silver-framed photograph on a nearby table 3 figures younger, smiling Lydia's arm around a smaller Marcus James, beaming beside them. My room used to look like this, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Dusty and untouched after after things changed. When my mother passed, I couldn't bring myself to go in there for months. His fingers flexed on the armrests of his chair. You should go, now, before the hour is up. I will, she replied calmly. When the hour's up, or when your father officially fires me, whichever comes first. He turned fully towards her, then his expression a mask of defiance. I don't want you here. Is that clear enough? Didn't expect a welcome mat or a ticker tape parade. Marcus stared nonplussed. She met his gaze evenly without flinching. She tilted her head. Look, Marcus, I'm not here to fix you. I'm not sure I even know how to fix myself at this point. But I don't scare easily anymore. Not since recently. The image of Sal's knife glinting in the alley light was suddenly vivid. Why did you take this job? He demanded, suspicion hardening his features. No one willingly walks into a situation like this. She shrugged a small, weary movement. Because it was offered. Because the alternative involved sleeping in a bus station. And because I made a promise to the thing currently using my bladder as a trampoline. She patted her stomach gently. That I was done running. From everything and everyone. The silence in the room shifted, became less charged, more thoughtful. He didn't repeat his request for her to leave. A grandfather clock in the hall outside chimed the half-hour, its resonant tones echoing through the quiet wing. 58 minutes left by my count, Rachel said lightly. But according to that clock, maybe 30. Unless you want to make a friendly wager on how quickly you can actually get rid of me. Marcus turned back to the window, his shoulders slumped. You won't last. None of them do. Rachel leaned her head back against the worn velvet of the chair, closing her eyes for a moment. Maybe not, she conceded. But if I'm going down, Marcus, I'd rather go down in a room with a decent view and a roof than in an alley with rats for company and a man named Sal breathing down my neck. He didn't smile, but the white-knuckled clenching of his fingers on the armrests visibly lessened. Rain returned with a vengeance by evening, lashing against the Gothic windows of the mansion. Rachel, having changed into an old soft gray sweater and leggings Mrs. Hargrove had quietly left for her, carried a small worn blanket, her own, into Marcus's room. She didn't approach his bed, but settled again in the armchair by the bookcase, the blanket draped over her lap. "So now what?" Marcus asked, his voice flat, suspicious. He'd been listening to music through his headphones, but had pulled them off when she entered. "You just sit there. Are you going to stare at me until I crack?" Rachel shrugged, a subtle wince crossing her face as she rubbed her lower back. "Pretty much. Unless you formally kick me out. Or you know your father does." She began speaking softly, her voice a low murmur, almost as if talking to herself. "There was an old, upright piano at the community center near where I was staying for a while. Keys were yellowed like old teeth, some of them stuck if you pressed too hard. Someone had left behind a tattered dog-eared book of Chopin nocturnes." No reaction. Marcus stared out the window on the rhythmic sweep of the rain, his only apparent interest. Rachel's voice stayed even almost hypnotic. "I used to sneak in late after everyone had gone home when the janitor was on his rounds elsewhere. I'd just sit there and touch the keys. Couldn't really play much then, not properly. Just remembered enough from my childhood lessons to make a broken, hesitant melody. Enough to feel the vibrations through my fingertips. Still nothing." She leaned her head back, closing her eyes. "I think some days I liked the silence of that room more than the sound of the music. The expectation of it, maybe." After a long pause, Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to see her in his peripheral vision. "You talk to pianos too. Is that what you do when you're not auditioning for Caregiver of the Year?" Rachel cracked an eye open, a faint smile touching her lips. "Pianos lamp posts my own feet when they refuse to move. It gets lonely being invisible, Marcus. You tend to make conversation with whatever's around. That's certifiably not normal." "Wasn't really going for normal. Normal packed its bags and left me a while ago." Marcus looked away, but the corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly. Her voice came again, softer still, a whisper directed towards her belly. "You've been quiet today, little one. Good choice. Rainy days are for staying still, for gathering strength. Maybe we'll get to stay here a while. Maybe not. Don't get too cozy just yet." Marcus shifted in his bed, restless. "You talk to it like it's actually listening to you. Isn't that the fundamental basis of all talking?" She countered gently. "Saying something into the void just in case someone or something is listening." He blinked, processing that. "You're profoundly weird," he finally declared. Rachel smiled faintly, a genuine smile this time, that briefly illuminated her tired face. "Thanks, I think." She curled further into the chair, her breathing slowing, evening out. Marcus looked over at her. Her shoes were muddy and propped on a small footstool she'd found. One cuff of her sweater was frayed. Her jaw was still tight, even in near sleep. But she'd come back. She hadn't brought cheerful, meaningless platitudes or forced jollity. She'd just sat, talked to the air, to the baby, to an old piano. Nearly 9 o'clock. No one came to remind him of bedtime routines anymore. They'd given up trying to enforce them. He looked at Rachel, properly asleep now. Her head had nodded forward, her dark hair obscuring her face, the worn blanket slipping from her shoulders. Marcus reached for the remote beside his bed, and with a hesitant finger nudged the control to dim the main room lights, leaving only a soft lamp glowing by the bookcase. He didn't quite know why he did it. He watched her for another long moment, and the soft rise and fall of her breathing, and then turned his gaze back to the stormy window. Rachel Moore slept on her hand, resting protectively on her belly, as if this cavernous room of ghosts and shadows was for now a sanctuary. Marcus let her stay. He didn't call for Mrs. Hargrove. He didn't hit the call button for his father. He just let her be. The next morning dawned cool and sharp, and the storm having swept the sky clean. Rachel entered Marcus's room carrying a rolled-up yoga mat and a small towel draped around her neck. She wore a loose black t-shirt that stretched taut over her belly and comfortable sweatpants. Marcus, who was attempting to navigate a complex video game, stared. "You have got to be kidding me." She dropped the mat with a soft thud. "Nope. Doctor's orders. Physical therapy. Prescribed by your physician, reiterated by your father, probably co-signed by Mrs. Hargrove, and quite possibly divinely ordained by God himself, given the amount of nagging involved. I'm not doing it." His voice was flat, resolute. "Good news. You don't have to. According to the very detailed notes, you just have to watch me do it until you get terminally bored, or until I pass out from exertion, whichever comes first." He stared at her, a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity in his eyes. "That's manipulative." She sank down onto the mat with a soft grunt, her movements careful but surprisingly fluid. She started with gentle stretches. And yet, here we both are. "Should you even be doing this?" He asked, a grudging note of something that might have been concern in his voice. "In your condition, you look like you're about to pop." "Worried about my delicate state, Marcus?" She teased, gently moving into a modified cat-cow stretch. He scowled, looking away. "No, just making an observation." "Good. Then let me be your cautionary tale for why regular movement is important." He wheeled his chair abruptly towards the window, presenting her with his back. 15 minutes passed in relative silence, punctuated only by Rachel's soft breathing and the occasional groan as she moved through a series of prenatal safe exercises. Eventually, the rhythmic nature of her movements, or perhaps sheer boredom, made him wheel back around. He watched her with a detached, critical air. When she finally eased herself to a standing position, flushed and slightly breathless, she said, "Your turn." "What part of paralyzed from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair did you fail to comprehend during your extensive briefing?" He asked, his voice laced with heavy sarcasm. "Unless your arms miraculously stopped working overnight along with your legs, we've got plenty to start with. Upper body strength core engagement from a seated position. There's a whole regimen. It won't help. Nothing helps?" His voice was bleak. "It might. We won't know unless we try." "It won't. Trust me on this." Rachel tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You sound very sure of that. Almost comfortable in your certainty." She walked over to a small cabinet and retrieved 2 small, 1-pound hand weights. She placed them carefully on his wheelchair tray. 10 minutes. No speeches. No dramatic pronouncements. Just movement. He stared at the weights as if they were venomous snakes. Rachel crouched down beside his chair, bringing herself to his eye level. It was an effort, and her back protested. "I don't pity you, Marcus. If that's what you're pushing back against, you're wasting valuable energy. Pity is useless. It's a corrosive emotion." His gaze flickered to hers, surprised by her directness. "You don't think I'm pathetic, a cripple living off his father's guilt?" "I think you're angry," she said softly but firmly. "I think you're smart. I think you're incredibly tired of being defined by one single event. I also think you're stronger than you believe. I'm just waiting for you to get tired of proving everyone else right and start proving it to yourself." Marcus picked up one of the weights, his expression still mutinous. That line probably sounded a lot cooler in your head. Rachel smiled faintly, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. It usually does. Most of my best lines do. He lifted the weight, his wrist trembling with the unaccustomed effort. 1 lift, 2. 10 minutes felt like an eternity. The next day, she coaxed 12 minutes out of him. By the 4th day, the biting sarcasm had lessened, replaced by a grudging compliance. He was still resistant, but a spark of something new, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a nascent determination, was beginning to show. "This is utterly pointless," he said on the 5th day, his arms shaking visibly as he lowered the weights. "I'm never going to walk again. This is just a performance for my father, so he can tell himself he's doing something." Rachel handed him a towel, her expression thoughtful. "Then don't do it to walk, Marcus. Do it to fight. Do it because every rep, every minute you push through is a small victory against the voice that tells you it's pointless." "Fight for what?" he demanded, his voice raw. "For a life spent in this damn chair, for a future I never asked for. For not becoming the kind of person who stops trying," she said quietly. "For not letting the anger and the grief win. For the memory of who you were, and for the possibility of who you still might become." Marcus paused, the weight heavy in his hand. "You're kind of intense, you know that." Rachel allowed herself a small, grim smile. "You'd be intense too if you'd recently been cornered in a dark, fetid alleyway with a broken bottle by a man who thought your unborn child was acceptable collateral for a debt that wasn't even yours." The words slipped out harsher than she intended, fueled by a sudden flashback. Marcus stared at her, his blue eyes wide with shock. "You... What's Sal? Is that his name?" She sat down on the edge of her mat, suddenly weary. "A few weeks ago. My ribs still ache when it rains too hard. But I didn't break Marcus. And I won't let you break either. Not if I can help it." Quietly, after a long moment, he asked, "Do you think you can scare me into trying harder by sharing your horror stories?" Rachel shook her head, her gaze softening. "No. I don't need you to be happy, Marcus. I don't even need you to like me, though it would probably make my workday more pleasant. I just need you not to give up on yourself. Because the moment you do that, everything else becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy." He looked down at the weights in his lap, then back at her determined face. He picked them up again. Outside the slightly ajar door, Mrs. Hargrove, who had paused on her way with fresh towels, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile before continuing on her way unseen. The art room, usually kept locked like a sacred tomb, became their occasional refuge, a neutral territory. James had reluctantly given Mrs. Hargrove a key with strict instructions, but it was only for supervised visits with Rachel present. It smelled faintly of dried oil paint, turpentine dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams, and a delicate, almost ghostly hint of his mother's favorite freesia perfume. Lydia's unfinished canvases still stood on easels draped with white cloths like patient ghosts. Sunlight, when it chose to appear, fell warmly on a magnificent dust-covered Steinway grand piano in the corner. This was her sanctuary. Marcus said one afternoon, his sketchbook open on his lap, charcoal stick poised. He wasn't drawing, just staring at the piano. She played that piano for hours. Bach, Chopin, Debussy. Sometimes things she made up herself. Rachel nodded. She'd noticed the pristine, almost revered condition of the piano itself compared to the other more casually forgotten items in the room. Even the dust on it seemed less settled, as if disturbed by a lingering presence. "It's a beautiful instrument. Does your father ever—" Marcus snorted. "My father," He wouldn't know a C sharp from a sea shanty. He appreciated her playing, I guess, in the way one appreciates fine art. But he never understood what it meant to her. His gaze drifted to a particular corner of the piano near the keyboard lid. She kept her special music books in the bench, the ones with her notes. "What's it like?" he asked abruptly later that week, as Rachel was carefully reshelving some of Lydia's art history books. "Being a mum, I mean. Knowing someone depends on you entirely." "I don't know yet, not really," she said honestly, her hand resting on her belly. "This little one hasn't arrived yet to ask me why life hurts or why the world is so unfair. They haven't yet looked at me with trusting eyes, needing answers I don't have." She paused, a wistful expression on her face. "The moment I knew I couldn't run anymore, that this was real. It wasn't when the pregnancy test came back positive. It was weeks later, after Mark. After he'd left. I was standing in line at a pharmacy, clutching a bottle of prenatal vitamins I could barely afford, feeling completely adrift. And suddenly, I just froze. Everyone else in the line blurred. And then I felt it. A tiny flutter, like a butterfly wing. The first kick. It was so small, almost imperceptible, but it was like this kid was reminding me, "Hey, I'm still here. We're in this together. Get your act together." Marcus was silent for a long time, sketching absently. Harsh, angular lines. "If you were my mum," he asked eventually, his voice carefully neutral, not looking up from his pad, "and you knew about this man, Sal, this threat, would you have stayed in that city? Would you have risked?" He trailed off. Rachel walked over to him, hesitated, then laid her hand gently over his, stilling the movement of the charcoal. "I would have done whatever it took to protect my child, Marcus. Absolutely anything. Running isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's the bravest, most pragmatic thing you can do when the odds are stacked against you." His fingers twitched beneath hers. "You didn't have to answer that. It was a stupid question." "I know. But I wanted to. I think about it all the time." Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, pulling his hand away. "If she'd lived, if she'd seen me like this, would she have stayed? Would she have eventually given up on me too?" The raw pain in his voice was a physical thing. "She loved you, Marcus," Rachel said softly. "Everyone says so. Mrs. Hargrove, your father, even the pictures of her show it. That kind of deep maternal love doesn't see the chair, it doesn't see the limitations. It just sees you." "She didn't get a choice to leave," he said bitterly, the words tearing from him. "But he did." The unspoken "dad" hung heavy and damning in the air. "He chose to disappear into his work, into his grief. He left me with a parade of strangers. Maybe that's why I hate everyone he hires, every attempt to replace her. They all feel like they're leaving before they've even properly arrived." "I'm not here to replace her, Marcus," Rachel said, her voice firm but gentle. "No one ever could." "I know." He conceded, a little of the fight draining out of him. "Logically, I know. But I'm not leaving either." She added, a small, almost fierce smile touching her lips. "Not voluntarily, anyway. Unless Sal Marchetti himself shows up at your ridiculously large front door with a welcoming committee, then all bets are decidedly off." The grim humor made him look up, startled, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. A few days later, Mrs. Hargrove appeared in the art room doorway, a dusty, unmarked cardboard box in her hands. "Your father asked me to clear out some of the attic storage. I found these. Your mother kept them meticulously. Your early drawings, and many of her personal music books, the ones she used most frequently. I thought you might like to have them here." She set the box carefully on the polished surface of the grand piano. Marcus approached hesitantly. Inside, nestled among brittle, childish scrawls of lopsided houses and stick figures, were beautifully bound, well-loved volumes of Chopin, Debussy, Bach, and even some surprisingly modern jazz composers. One volume of Chopin Nocturnes had a faded pressed cornflower tucked between its pages, its blue still vibrant. He didn't speak, but his eyes, those mirrors of his father's and his mother's, lingered on the flower, on the faint pencil annotations in Lydia's elegant script. He traced a finger over a particularly complex passage she had circled. "You're not like the others," he said to Rachel later that day, the comment almost an afterthought, spoken more to himself than to her. "You don't patronize." "Neither are you, Marcus," she replied quietly. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." Days melted into weeks. A fragile, unspoken rhythm began to establish itself. Rachel's quiet persistence, her refusal to be intimidated or discouraged, slowly chipped away at Marcus's defensive shell. He still had dark days when the anger and grief were overwhelming, but they were interspersed with moments of tentative connection. Then, one blustery evening, as James was reviewing financial reports in his study, he received a call on his private, unlisted line. Rachel, passing by with a tray for Marcus, saw his face go utterly pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. He hung up abruptly, looking deeply shaken, his eyes wide and unfocused. "That was a former business associate," he said, his voice strained, running a hand distractedly through his already disheveled hair. "Or rather, someone claiming to represent his interests, asking questions, very specific questions, about me, the estate, current security arrangements." Rachel felt a cold dread uncoil in her stomach, a sensation sickeningly familiar. "What kind of questions, James? About what?" She used his first name without thinking. "Nothing specific about you, if that's what you're worried about." He reassured her, though his own pallor belied his calm tone. "Just unsettling. Probing. Probably nothing. Just an old vulture smelling what he thinks is weakness." But it wasn't nothing. Rachel's instincts, honed by weeks of looking over her shoulder, screamed otherwise. A few nights later, a ferocious storm raged outside, mirroring with chilling accuracy the tempestuous night that had claimed Lydia's life. Rain lashed the windows in sheets, and the wind howled around the eaves of the old mansion like a grieving, tormented animal. Rachel was in Marcus's room, her presence now a comforting constant. She was reading aloud from The Velveteen Rabbit, her voice a low, steady anchor against the fury of the elements outside. She'd chosen it because she remembered her own mother reading it to her, and its themes of love and becoming real resonated. Suddenly, a deafening crash from downstairs. The distinct sound of shattering glass, followed by a heavy thud. Then, an abrupt, thick silence, more terrifying than the storm itself. The electricity flickered, then died, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the emergency backup light in the hallway that cast long dancing shadows. What was that? Marcus whispered, his eyes wide and luminous in the gloom, his hand instinctively reaching for the controls of his chair. "Stay here, Marcus. Don't move." Rachel commanded, her own heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her hand went protectively to her belly. Sal, could he have found her even here in this fortress? The thought was paralyzing. She moved cautiously to the door, cracked it open, and listened intently. Footsteps, heavy, unfamiliar, crunched on what sounded like broken debris on the marble floor of the main hall. A rough, chillingly familiar voice, but not Sal's, called out, laced with a terrifying blend of malice and triumph, "Whitmore, James Whitmore. I know you're in here, you coward, and I know all about your new little charity case, the pregnant one. Time to pay what you owe, Whitmore, one way or another. Recompense will be made tonight. Rachel froze ice flooding her veins. Not Sal. Silas Vance. The name Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned. The drunk driver. James's voice, tight with a mixture of fury and disbelief, echoed up the grand staircase. Vance, Silas. Vance, is that you? What in God's name do you think you're doing, man? You're trespassing. I'll call the police. A little late for that, Whitmore. Vance's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. Your fancy security system was surprisingly easy to bypass, especially when the power's out. And I cut your phone lines just in case. Mrs. Hargrove materialized silently beside Rachel in the dim hallway, her face a grim, ashen mask. Silas Vance. She whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He was the other driver the night of the accident. Drunk, they said. He always blamed Mrs. Whitmore, blamed your father for his prison sentence. James shielded Marcus from the worst of the details. Vance has been in prison for years. He must have just gotten out. He swore then at the trial he'd get his recompense when he was free. Her eyes, usually so sharp, were wide with fear. Terror, sharp, immediate, and all-encompassing, seized Rachel. This wasn't about her sordid past with Sal. This was about theirs, James's and Marcus's, a vengeful ghost from their own tragedy come to exact a terrible price. He's unhinged. Mrs. Hargrove whispered urgently, her hand gripping Rachel's arm. Completely. We have to lock this door now. Rachel fumbled with the heavy old lock on Marcus's door as the shouting escalated downstairs. A sickening thud, a choked cry. Then James cried out sharply in pain. Dad! Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with fear, pushing his wheelchair with surprising force towards the door. No, Marcus, stay back. Rachel pulled him, her mind racing. The intercom, Mrs. Hargrove, is there another way to call for help? The panic button on his chair controls. Mrs. Hargrove hissed. James had it installed. Before Marcus could react, before Rachel could secure the lock, the bedroom door splintered violently inward with a deafening crack. Silas Vance stood framed in the doorway, wild-eyed and disheveled, rain plastering his lank hair to his skull. He held a heavy, menacing crowbar in one hand, and something glinted metallically in the other, a gun. Well, well, the happy little family cowering in the dark. His burning gaze landed on Rachel's prominent belly, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Another precious Whitmore to ruin, or maybe you're just the hired help, preggers and all. Whitmore always did have a pathetic savior complex. Thought he could save my brother, too. His brother. The incongruous detail snagged in Rachel's fear-addled mind. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through Rachel's lower abdomen, so intense it stole her breath. She gasped, clutching her stomach, doubling over. Premature. Oh God, no, not now, please, not now. Get away from her. Marcus, transformed by adrenaline and terror for Rachel, wheeled himself defiantly between her and Vance, somehow managing to snatch the small 1-pound hand weights from his tray, clutching them like pathetic, desperate weapons. I'll scream, the police will come. Vance laughed, a harsh, grating, utterly mirthless sound that scraped Rachel's raw nerves. Brave little cripple. Your father's paying for more than just Lydia tonight, boy. He's paying for Daniel. For what he did to my brother. He advanced the gun, now clearly visible. Suddenly, Mrs. Hargrove, with an agility that belied her age and stoic demeanor, lunged from the side, swinging a heavy bronze reading lamp from a nearby table with surprising force. It connected with Vance's gun arm. He roared in pain and fury, the gun clattering across the polished floorboards, skittering under a chest of drawers. He still had the crowbar. In that same chaotic instant, Rachel felt a sudden, unmistakable gush of warmth. Her water had broken. The pain intensified, ripping through her, coiling her into a tight knot of agony. The baby. she gasped, sinking to her knees. It's coming. James stumbled into the doorway, bleeding profusely from a gash on his forehead, his expensive shirt torn, but his eyes were blazing with a desperate protective fury. Vance, you bastard, get out of my house. Leave them alone. The fight that ensued was brutal, terrifyingly chaotic in the dim, storm-lashed room. Vance, enraged, swung the crowbar wildly. James, though injured, met him head-on, driven by a primal need to protect his son and the woman carrying her child. Mrs. Hargrove incredibly bravely tried to shield Rachel, positioning herself between the flailing madman and the laboring woman. Marcus, fumbling with shaking hands, repeatedly slammed the panic button wired to his chair controls, praying it was independently powered and still functional. Sirens, faint at first, then growing unmistakably louder, began to wail in the far distance. Vance, hearing the approaching sirens, realizing his twisted plan for prolonged terror was unraveling, became even more desperate. He made a lunging grab for Rachel. If I'm going down Whitmore, I'm taking something precious of yours with me. An eye for an eye, a child for a life. James threw himself in front of Rachel, intercepting Vance's lunge. They crashed heavily against a large oak wardrobe. The struggle was desperate, terrifyingly close. Rachel screamed as another contraction, fiercer than the last, ripped through her, blotting out everything but the searing pain and the overwhelming fear for her baby. Then, with a final sickening thud, it was over. Vance lay unconscious, possibly worse, on the floor. James stood over him, chest-heaving, blood dripping from his forehead into his eyes. Mrs. Hargrove was kneeling, trying to pry the crowbar from Vance's limp hand. Rachel. James, his face a mask of blood, terror, and dawning horror, rushed to her side. The baby. Eleanor, call an ambulance now. For God's sake, tell them it's premature. Tell them there are injuries. Rachel's world narrowed to a terrifying vortex of pain, fear, and the approaching sirens. James, the baby. Sal, he didn't. She managed, confused, disoriented. Not Sal, Rachel. James grunted, pressing a towel Mrs. Hargrove thrust at him to his bleeding head. It was Vance, all Vance. But the truth, God, the truth is far worse. The twist was coming. She felt it even through the haze of pain. The full nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning to unfold. The hospital room was a blur of sterile, white, incessant beeping machines and hushed, urgent voices. Rachel drifted in and out of consciousness, flashes of the violent struggle in Marcus's room replaying like a horrifying film loop. When she finally surfaced to a semblance of lucidity, James was by her side, his hand cleaned and bandaged, covering hers. His face was pale and bruised stitches stark against his temple, but his eyes were fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. Marcus was in his wheelchair nearby, his face equally pale, his usual defiance, replaced by a look of shocked vulnerability. Mrs. Hargrove stood a little apart, her composure regained, but her eyes red-rimmed. The baby. Rachel whispered, her throat raw, the word a prayer. James's eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw, complex tenderness she'd never witnessed. A girl, Rachel. She's very small, tiny in the NICU, but she's fighting. The doctors say she has your spirit. She's a fighter just like her mother. Tears, hot and unstoppable, streamed down Rachel's face, tracks of salt on her grimy cheeks. Silas Vance. What he said, his brother. Sal. Her mind was a chaotic jumble. Vance is in police custody. He'll be charged with attempted murder, assault, breaking and entering. The works this time. It was him, not your past, not Sal, that came for us tonight. James said, his voice thick with a self-reproach that was almost palpable. It seems my desperate attempt to keep you safe, to offer you sanctuary, perversely brought this danger closer. He wasn't just a drunk driver, Rachel. There's more. Much more. He took a deep, ragged breath. Vance's brother Daniel owned a small tech startup years ago. My investment firm. We acquired them. Hostile takeover. Daniel was ruined. He lost everything. He killed himself a few months later. Silas Vance blamed me, blamed my ruthless tactics. The accident that killed Lydia and injured Marcus. Vance was drunk, yes, but he recognized my car. It was road rage fueled by years of festering hatred for me. He swerved intentionally. He always maintained Lydia wasn't the target I was. James's voice broke. I hid that. I hid the depth of his animosity, my partial culpability in his brother's fate. I told myself it was to protect Marcus, but it was also to protect myself from the shame. He'd been watching the house. Marcus interjected, his voice hoarse, trembling. Vance had hired a private investigator. He knew Dad had hired someone new. He must have learned about your pregnancy. He thought threatening you another innocent would break my father faster, make him pay in a way that just hurting him wouldn't. Oh, God. Rachel whispered, the full weight of James's confession of Vance's twisted motive crashing down on her. The room spun. Lydia, Marcus. Victims not just of a drunk driver, but of a chain of events James himself had set in motion. I was a jerk. Marcus continued, unbidden tears welling in his eyes and spilling down his cheeks. I was awful to you. I pushed you away. But when Vance came at you, and you were in so much pain. He couldn't finish. You were both incredibly brave, Marcus. Rachel whispered, reaching a shaky hand towards him. You, your father, Mrs. Hargrove. You saved us. She's a warrior, that one. James said, managing a ghost of a smile as he glanced at Mrs. Hargrove. Apparently, her late husband, a former Royal Marine, taught her a few things about self-defense with household objects. Mrs. Hargrove merely sniffed, but a faint blush rose on her cheeks. Over the next few agonizing days, the sterile, hushed quiet of the hospital, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors, became their new shared purgatory. James rarely left Rachel's side, except for brief, tense consultations with doctors and the police. Marcus visited daily, his silences now less hostile, more contemplative. The raw terror of that night and the shocking revelation of James's secret slowly began to solidify into a new, incredibly fragile and uncertain bond. James, stripped bare of his defenses, finally told Marcus the unvarnished truth about the accident. Vance's targeted recklessness, his own company's role in Daniel Vance's demise, the cover-up by Vance's then influential family that had initially tried to shift all blame onto road conditions, and his own overwhelming, suffocating guilt and fear for Marcus afterwards that had made him retreat emotionally, becoming a ghost in his own home. I failed you, son. James said, his voice heavy with unshed tears, as he sat by Marcus's side in Rachel's room. I failed Lydia by not being honest about the threats my business world could generate. I thought wealth could protect us from anything. I didn't know how to be a father who couldn't fix things, who was in part responsible for breaking them. Marcus looked at his father, really looked at him perhaps for the first time in years, seeing not just the distant, powerful benefactor, but a flawed, grieving man. You're here now, Marcus said quietly, the words surprisingly gentle. You didn't run this time. That's a start, I guess. When Rachel was marginally stronger after an emergency C-section, they took her in a wheelchair to see their daughter. A tiny, impossibly perfect human being dwarfed by the incubator, she lay in a tangle of wires and tubes connecting her to life-sustaining machines, but fighting with a strength that belied her size. Hope Lydia Whitmore, they named her. Hope for the future Lydia, in loving memory. Rachel watched James gazing at Hope, his strong face etched with a love so profound, so vulnerable, it ached to witness. His hand, large and scarred, rested near the incubator, as if wanting to touch her, but afraid of her fragility. "She's so beautiful," Rachel whispered, tears blurring her vision. "She's a miracle," James replied, his voice choked. He turned to Rachel, his eyes filled with a desperate gratitude. "And so are you, Rachel Moore. You both are." One quiet afternoon, Rachel found Marcus sitting alone by Hope's incubator, just looking his sketchbook lying unopened on his lap. "She's so incredibly small," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the machinery. It's terrifying." "It is," Rachel agreed, her own heart constricting with a fierce protective love. "But she's strong. She has to be. Like you," he said, then flushed as if surprised by his own words. He looked down at his hands. You can't leave, you know. Not now. Not after all this. Hope needs you. We need you." The confession was rushed, awkward, but achingly sincere. Rachel's heart clenched. This was more complicated than a job. This was something else entirely. "Marcus." James entered the NICU, then, having spoken to Hope's neonatologist, he caught the end of Marcus's plea. "He's right, Rachel." His voice was quiet, devoid of its usual authority, replaced by a hesitant humility. "I didn't just hire you to care for my son. I invited you into our lives, however clumsily. And through all this hell, I've realized how much we both need you. This isn't about a job anymore, if it ever truly was. This is about family, or the possibility of one. If you'll still have us after everything I've hidden, everything I've done wrong." He reached for her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I've made so many mistakes, Rachel. Let me try, please. Let me try to do this one thing right. Stay. Please stay." Rachel looked from James's earnest, pleading face to Marcus's equally desperate eyes, then to the tiny, fragile infant fighting for her life in the incubator. Her past with Sal seemed a distant, faded nightmare compared to the immediate, complex reality of these three broken souls. "I'm not your mother," she told Marcus, gently, needing to be clear. "I can't replace Lydia." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I finally understand that. But you're something else. You're Rachel. You're Hope's mom. And you're ours now, I think, whether you like it or not." A watery, shaky attempt at a smile. Rachel felt a sob mixed with a laugh escape her. It was all too much, too raw, too soon. But it was also undeniably real. "Okay," she whispered, tears flowing freely again. "Okay." She looked directly at James, a new strength hardening her gaze. "But on my terms. Completely. Anything." He breathed relief, washing over his face. "Anything you ask." "We eat dinner together, every night, all of us. No exceptions unless someone is medically indisposed. And we talk. About the good, the bad, the ugly, the scary. No more secrets, James. Ever. The truth, however painful." She turned to Marcus, her expression softening. "And you, young man, you keep working with that beautiful piano in the art room. Your mother's music deserves to be heard in that house again, not just exist as a ghost. And maybe, just maybe, if you're not too much of a know-it-all, you let me teach you a little of what I remember." Marcus almost smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face. "Deal." Mrs. Hargrove, who had appeared silently in the doorway, with a thermos of chamomile tea and a small plate of biscuits, simply said, her voice imbued with a deep satisfaction. "Well, it's about bloody time this household started acting like a proper family." Months later, vibrant autumn painted the Virginia hills in breathtaking hues of gold, crimson, and russet. Hope Lydia Whitmore, against considerable odds, was home a small, gurgling, thriving miracle, who had the entire expanded household, including a rotating cast of highly vetted nurses for her first few months, wrapped around her tiny, demanding finger. The West Wing, once Rachel's lonely temporary haven, was now a bright, warm, joy-filled nursery, filled with soft toys, mobiles, and the faint, sweet scent of baby powder and love. Sal Marchetti, Rachel had learned through a discreet inquiry James had made via a security contact, had been arrested on unrelated charges a few weeks after she'd fled the city. A small mercy. But the edge of that fear, the what if, never entirely faded. James, meanwhile, was navigating the complex legal and financial fallout from the public revelations about Daniel Vance's company and his own past ruthless business practices. There were investigations, lawsuits threatened. His empire was shaken, his reputation irrevocably altered. He faced it with a new quiet stoicism Rachel admired. The magnificent Steinway grand piano in the art room, once his mother's cherished sanctuary, was no longer silent, no longer draped in dust and sorrow. Marcus, guided initially by Rachel's patient instruction and then increasingly by his own rediscovered passion and Lydia's annotated scores, was coaxing hesitant, then stronger, more confident melodies from its keys. Bach's intricate fugues, Chopin's heartbreaking nocturnes, Debussy's shimmering preludes. Sometimes James would stand in the doorway, unseen, just listening. He wasn't a tech billionaire in those moments, nor a grieving widower haunted by past mistakes. He was simply a father, a man slowly, painfully learning to live, and perhaps even to forgive himself again. One crisp October evening, as the sun dipped below the crimson-leaved trees, casting long, benevolent shadows across the manicured lawns, Rachel sat on the porch swing, holding Hope close, humming a wordless lullaby her own mother used to sing. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Marcus sat beside her, not on the swing, but on the wide piano bench they'd moved out there, carefully playing a simple, poignant Chopin piece, one of his mother's absolute favorites. James stood leaning against a porch pillar watching them, a soft, melancholic smile playing on his lips. The deep scars of their shared trauma remained etched into their souls, a permanent reminder of fragility, of loss of battles fought and barely won. But they were also testament to their resilience, their capacity for healing. The old mansion no longer swallowed sound and light. It amplified life, laughter, arguments, and the complex, sometimes dissonant, but ultimately beautiful notes of a family finding its arduous way, not perfectly, not without ongoing struggle, but undeniably together. The ghost of Sal still occasionally flickered at the very distant edge of Rachel's memory, a faint reminder of a past she'd narrowly, miraculously escaped, but the present, rich, messy, imperfect, and overwhelmingly full of demanding love and the sweet, milky scent of her daughter, was far more potent, far more real. They were all still healing, each in their own way, at their own pace. But for the very first time, in what felt like an eternity, the future felt less like an encroaching threat and more like a fragile, tentative, but deeply welcome invitation.